Well, hello everyone. This is Jeffrey Daugherty, the Christian whistleblower, with the Jeffrey Daugherty Show. So glad to have you back. Hope you've been following us. This is the last show that we'll be talking about the Apostle Paul Antichrist book as far as going through it almost page by page, certainly chapter by chapter, section by section. Got kind of sick and tired of everybody saying, oh, it's just a novel, he just made it up. So anybody that wants to say that, if you've not listened to these past few broadcasts, then you need to just shut it up and not say anything, because we addressed everything in intimate detail. And today I want to finish up the last little bit of interesting, just incredible facts from the book, and then bring up a couple things that listeners brought up that I did not see fully until they did. And one of them, in fact, leads into the new book, Aliens in the New Testament, the last final message of the last apostle. But at any rate, we want to talk about the final crazy, we want to call them coincidences, call them irony. But sometimes you have to wonder if they're not just plain old flat out prophecy. In AD 68, most of you are aware that the Roman army under the general Titus came and surrounded the city of Jerusalem and eventually did destroy the city, burned it to the ground. Over 1 million people died in that horrible conflagration. The back, really, of the Jesus movement, the original Jesus movement, was broken. Vast number of its adherents were killed in Jerusalem, or were scattered to the four winds, as it were. Because remember, Jesus' message, the original Jesus movement, and of course Jesus' real name was Yahushua, or Yeshua, but the original Jesus movement was strongest in Jerusalem and was spreading outward. And of course Paul's message is just the opposite: weak in Jerusalem and strong in the outlying areas, Antioch, and around. But at any rate, in AD 68, Titus marched his Roman legions into Judea, surrounded Jerusalem. And one thing that not a lot of people know that is brilliant, and yet it's chillingly horrific, was the fact that it was Passover time. And if you know anything about the Jewish faith, everyone is required to go to Jerusalem, or at least was in those days when the temple was still standing, to go there 3 times a year. To go there for Passover, to go there for Tabernacles, and I forget the other one. I think it was Day of Atonement, most likely. But they had to go to Jerusalem for those 3 feasts at least, or those 3 festivals every year. So having Jerusalem surrounded by the Roman army, and people wanting to go to Jerusalem for the festival of Passover, created quite a problem. And the city of Jerusalem would swell to 3 and 4 times its size when it was Passover, or when it was a festival and people were flowing into the city. So in what appeared to be initially a supremely humane gesture, the Roman general Titus allowed a column to be opened, and allowed the city gates to be opened, and allowed people safe passage into the city of Jerusalem for Passover. He allowed them safe travel into the city of Jerusalem for Passover. And that seemed, wow, that's great of him to do that. What a nice guy. But the reality of it was that he let them all into Jerusalem, and then he closed the gates and wouldn't let anybody out. So a city that was already under siege and having troubles was not allowed to be able to be emptied of the visitors. So it created a huge hardship on the city. It created a huge drain on dwindling resources. And all of a sudden, things were so bad that you had no water, you had no food. Sanitation was a horrible issue, and there was even rumors of cannibalism occurring in the city. So what seemed to be a supremely humane gesture really was just a brilliant tactical military move to put stress on an already stressed population. And long story short, they breached the city walls, killed a lot of people, but there was a large number of people holed up in the temple that had not been conquered. And they're trying to go through the walls, trying to go through the walls, trying to go through the walls of the temple with no success. And there was a servant, not a servant, but he was on the staff, a junior officer, maybe a senior officer, but he was junior to Titus. His name was, where it was Tiberius. And that name Tiberius is familiar to a lot of you from James T. Kirk of Star Trek fame. The T in James T. Kirk stood for Tiberius. He was named after this great warrior who was to go on to become a general. But Tiberius was trying to offer a plan to stop going through the walls and to go through the doors of the temple, which were thought to be especially strong and impregnable. But finally, after battering the walls and not meeting with success, they listened to Tiberius. And here's the part that is just almost beyond belief, truth being stranger than fiction. The reason why Tiberius knew about the doors and knew about their weakness was because Tiberius was a Jew. And Tiberius's father was the person that donated the money to make the great temple doors, and as such, he was privy to details of their construction, and Tiberius himself, being privy to details of the construction, was able to know where the weaknesses were, and sure enough, they were able to breach the temple through the doors, and the rest, they say, is history. But a Jewish general provided the intelligence to destroy the Jerusalem nation, the Jewish nation, to destroy the temple at Jerusalem. And I can't help but wonder or draw a parallel or think about the fact that what was really in all effects the end of the Jewish world, the end of the Jewish society, the end of Jewish religion truly as it had been for thousands of years, came from an insider who never did, by the way, renounce his Judaism. And here the Jesus movement at the same time comes to an end in its reality and its fullness enlarged by a man named Saul, who called himself Paul, who also was a traitor from the inside. And Jesus said he was the door, and anybody that came in any other way than the door was a thief. And it's interesting, the parallel between temple doors and Tiberius, and the door being the message of Jesus and Paul. So very, very interesting there. And that's kind of the last OMG moment in the Apostle Paul Antichrist. And you can get that book. You can write me at gothamltd@gmail.com or nckabbalah@gmail.com. Go on to Facebook, Jeffrey A. Daugherty or Jeff Daugherty Show. And you can also go on to Twitter at nckabbalah and find out how to get hold of that book. We're gonna launch a special here real quickly as soon as we get the website back up. And speaking of the website, and when the show is running right, as it's not now, you hear Cliff Desmond doing the opening and doing the closing. And Cliff brought something to my attention which I had completely forgotten about, which goes into my new book, but we're not going to go into the new book. But we talked about how, or he sent me an email that said, "Hey Jeff," I actually think it was a Facebook message. He said, "Didn't Jesus tell the Pharisees that their father was the devil. And could this mean that, be in reference to your teaching about the Lord being the devil? Yahweh, the Lord, L-O-R-D. If you go back in my YouTube here, you'll see some shows about that not too far back. And it was an incredible find by Cliff, and I had known it, but I didn't really know it. And that's the thing about one person, it's hard to know everything, but when you have people like Cliff and like John Murray, we're going to talk about here in a moment, that brought up another great point. But the verse that Cliff was alluding to is in John, which is interesting because John is the last apostle, and he's the one that wrote the final message of the last apostle that deals with aliens in the New Testament and many other things that are all intertwined. But that's the new book, Aliens in the New Testament, final message of the last apostle. And John, in chapter 8 of his gospel, number 44, verse number 44, he says, you are of your father the devil, and the lust of your father you'll do. He was a murderer from the beginning. He abode not in the truth, because there's no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. And wow, I mean, that's just amazing. And they were obviously they considered Yahweh or the Lord their father. And Jesus knew this. And this was always one of those verses, again, like the men as trees walking. They just kind of didn't sit with me right. There was something weird about the verse, because Jesus was never, I mean, he never just threw out insults just to throw out insults. And this appeared an insult. Your dad is the devil. But it really wasn't. It's a profound statement that leads into a profoundly deep truth that we'll be exploring in that new book and in shows to come, and already have, if you look back on shows about the Lord, capital L-O-R-D, or Yahweh, that he was the devil, the enemy, the serpent, the great dragon, the great red dragon, the person that destroyed the earth, in Genesis 1:2, and between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, that was the Lord. Jesus says he was the devil, and that's a little teaser for you. Thank you, Cliff Desmond, for that incredible find, and it's very profound. And John Murray wrote me, and I had mentioned about how in Acts chapter 9, in one of the many and sundry descriptions of Paul's conversion, as soon as he gets converted, quote unquote, by something that he identifies as Jesus, that Jesus identified as Satan. And again, you'll need to go back and look at the conversion of Paul's shows to get the whole truth on this. But Paul said the exact scenario that Paul described in Acts chapter 9 and called it Jesus. Jesus described the same exact scenario in Luke chapter 10 and called it Satan. And Saul, whenever he got his sight back, satanic serpentine scales fell from his eyes. And before that, as soon as he was converted, he went to the house of Judas. And of course, John Murray correctly pointed out that people that are reading this in the first century, when it was originally written as the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, when they heard terms like house of Judas, they were thinking in Old Testament terms. The house of Saul, Saul was the king, and there was, the dynasties or the families were called the house of Saul, and the house of David, and the house of Judas here. It's a clear allusion and a clue, a code, if you will, by Luke, that Paul, not only is his conversion contradictory, not only is his conversion satanic as defined by Jesus, not only do serpentine, satanic scales fall from his eyes, but he also goes to the house of Judas right at his conversion, a very clear allusion to the fact that Paul was of the house of the traitors. Paul was of the house of the non-truth and those that would seek to destroy the message of Yahushua. And if you know anything about Jesus, he is often linked to the house of David genealogically, and he's talked about, he's the root of the house of David. He's the lion of the tribe of Judah, which of course is a Davidic lineage. And you've got the house of Saul. Saul was the first king. He turned out to be a false, terrible king, a guy that was against the true religion, or what they thought was the true religion. Carries right on into Saul of Tarsus. Saul is of that false house. He's of the house of Judas the traitor. And Jesus, Yahushua, of the house of the great King David. And John Murray went so far as to suggest, and I certainly can't deny this, and it's, if nothing, very, very interesting. What if Jesus were the reincarnation of King David, and Saul of Tarsus was the reincarnation of the evil King Saul? It's possible, but they are at least a spiritual type of one another. Jesus is kind of the fulfillment of the righteous great King David. Saul would be the fulfillment of the unrighteous King Saul. And Luke tied Saul and Saul together in a couple of other verses, and you can go back and listen to that as well. So, interesting points to ponder. Did you know that the Jewish temple was destroyed by a Jewish officer providing inside and traitorous information to the Romans? How ironic. What a coincidence that the Jesus movement's back was originally broken. The original Jesus movement's back was broken by a traitor who claimed to be one of them, who gave information again to Rome. Interesting, interesting stuff. And by the way, that traitor Saul, as according to the Josephus, was safe and sound in Rome, living a life of luxury while Jerusalem burned. And then finally, David, King David, being the spiritual, at least, progenitor of Jesus, the house of David, house of righteousness. And then Saul continuing the house of the evil and wicked King Saul. And Saul, a.k.a. Paul, also being a member of the house of Judas, the house of the traitors. Thank you to Cliff Desmond. Thank you to John Murray for that great information. Continue to send that to me, if you will. Not only you two gentlemen, but anybody and everybody else. I certainly read it all and do pay attention to that which is presented to me. In fact, we've got a lot of good stuff from John Murray. We're going to have to do a show and kind of annotate and list through that stuff. But I've got something coming up this week. Some of the things we're going to be talking about, I'm running a little overtime here, but that's okay. I want to talk about how Jesus said he was the way, the truth, and the life. The way, the truth, and the life. But he also said his body was of no consequence, or the things he did in it were of no consequence. And, you know, kind of look at that. It's a little bit puzzling. Also look at the whosoever wills of Revelation 22:17 and John 7:37. I'm going to look at Christian heritage. I want to look at the Trojan horse. I want to look at some different triangles that talk about communication and personal development. We want to talk about Bible betrayal. And I also want to talk about something that I'm calling the sheep trick. So we've got a lot of very interesting things coming up. Sheep trick, they need you to need them. And some of you that know a little bit about 70s music will kind of see the little bit of rhyme in that, or the cute little analogy. But interesting stuff. Listen to all this. Go back, re-listen. I'm Jeffrey Daugherty. Very appreciative of the information that you share with me and send to me. Very appreciative at all the... Cliff Desmond shared a picture the other day on Facebook. It was a picture of Jesus, holding a sign, and obviously you can do a little bit of print shop and put anything you want in there. And it said, "Thank you, Jeffrey Daugherty," which I got a real crack up over. Thanks for that, Cliff, and thanks you gentlemen for sharing that information. And we'll be back with more great stuff the rest of the week. A little bit over today in time, but I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, this is Jeffrey Daugherty, the Christian Whistleblower, and I'm wishing you peace and light.